This is perhaps the most famous walkway in Indianapolis Motor Speedway history, Gasoline Alley. Of course, on race morning, the drivers are going in the opposite direction. This is where, of course, their car gets towed out. That takes them right along pit road, and they wave to the fans who've lined up, maybe hoping to get an autograph or a picture. But it hasn't always looked this way here at Gasoline Alley. These garages just over to my right now serve primarily as things with gift shops and other such auxiliary activity. Those are the garages that were built back in 2000 when Formula One first came here to IMS. They're still used as garages from time to time when sports cars and other such series come. But if you follow me into the garage area here, this is one of the advantages of the gold badge. Of course, a silver badge gets you in here throughout the course of the month, or a bronze badge depending on what exactly you want to see. But this garage area hasn't always looked like this. This area right here was originally called basically the south end, or the South Bank garages. There was one row of the garages that moved from, actually at that time, east to west. Then there was another one just beyond that. That was back in 1920 when the garages were first built here at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Of course, that was where they'd come. They were green and white wooden garages back in those days, and people would come and the innovation would take place to try to be one of the 33 fastest to run in the greatest race in the world. Problem with that innovation is sometimes it backfired a little bit. Like, for example, George Barringer. He was in 1941 out here in the garage area, and his car had a rear engine, worked with a special kind of fuel. That was all good until another driver by the last name of Thorne was trying to weld together something on his car, and part of that weld spark hit that fuel, and the next thing you knew, a huge fire took place. They still ran the race in 1941, but it was delayed a little bit at the start because of a massive fire that took place here throughout the garage area. Of course, it would come out that a year later they wouldn't run the race at all. World War II shut it down until 1945. Just after that, of course, is when Tony Holman built it and got things burning back again in 1946. But enough about that, and back to the garages. The garage areas here are designed, and matter of fact, you might even be able to come and see inside of one of them here. There's not a lot to see, but all of the teams have specified garage areas where they work throughout the course of the month for practice, qualifying, and getting set to get their car as fast as possible to try to win the race. Usually, most of the teams have a preferred area. Roger Penske's team is usually down on the far right-hand side, for example, within this installment. There are 96 total garages. Probably pretty dark inside right now, but this gives you an idea. It doesn't look like much, but as you can see, if you look to the right now that I turn the lights on, it's just an old-fashioned workshop, a lab, if you will, where speed is found and every detail is looked over all day and all night long. You better hope you don't crash during qualifying or practice, or else your team's going to be in these garage areas working in one of these 96 garages until things, of course, are ready to roll the car back out. Speaking of 96, that's 10 years after 1986. 1986 was when these concrete surface garages were built, the installment as we know them today. 36 years now these garages have been here. And like I said, right now it's quiet, but soon it will be a buzz of activity as everybody tries to become one of those cars that takes the green flag for the Indianapolis 500. Just to the west of the garage area here is the Indiana University Health Infield Care Center. Now, this is, of course, a very, very important part of this facility. There are actually 15 first aid stations that take place throughout the course of this facility that are active anytime that there's activity at IMS. But in terms of the race itself, this building is important, and it's a partnership that lasts over 100 years between IMS and Indiana University Health, dating back to 1908 when Methodist Hospital first opened. In 1910, when the Indianapolis Motor Speedway was running cars here, it was 5 years after Carl Fisher had a vision of a speedway, but knew that he needed medical care there in case of an emergency. The earliest photos of 1910 show that there was an ambulance from Methodist Hospital here on the grounds during the race itself. Methodist Hospital had opened in 1908. Eventually, the Infield Care Center here was built, and the rules are pretty simple. The AMR safety team, which is the absolute best in the business, are the first on scene whenever there's an accident or an incident involving a driver on track. As a matter of fact, the Indycar series is the only series in North America that carries with it and travels with it its own medical team, the same men and women at every single racetrack, which is critical because when a driver has an incident, they'll be the first to tell you. When they look up, they like to see those familiar faces of those men and women that they know throughout traveling over the course of the series. One thing to look for, and I certainly hope it is never a situation where you have to look for it, but when a driver comes to a rest after an accident, they'll lift their visor. That tells the safety team that the driver is awake and alert, so therefore they can gauge exactly what they're in for when they get to the driver, or if there's another driver whose visor is down, they can prioritize exactly where the care happens. But they bring them here to the infield care center, and you'll often see that when a driver's released, they come out and they come to this fenced-in area. This is probably the second worst part of their day. The worst being the crash, the second being having to stand here and answer to all of it to the media. Now, there are a couple of helicopters that sit right behind here, and you might ask yourself, are they always airlifted to Methodist Hospital? Well, rarely, but those helicopters are there for a reason. Let's say, hypothetically, it's very late in the race. Like, for example, in 1996, Alexander Sampedri and Roberto Guerrero had a terrible crash as the checkered flag fell. Well, a lot of the fans were leaving, so you can imagine trying to get an ambulance to Methodist Hospital from here. In the case that somebody needs to be transported, they will use the helicopters in that situation. But typically, it's ground transportation that would be prioritized, and the helicopter would only be used in the most extreme of circumstances. But as we've talked about, safety is paramount at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and that's why it's great to have a trauma center right here on the ground, inside what Carl Fisher had envisioned some over 100 years ago, and that partnership that extends as far back as that as well. This is the north end at IMS, or just shy of it. You can see turns 3 and turn 4 behind me. Let me tell you a little story about how this place all came about. You know, Carl Fisher didn't have great eyesight, but he had great vision. And back in 1908, he had this idea that he was going to build a racetrack. He wanted to help innovation of the automobile. After a couple of years earlier, he'd gone to France and seen how popular it was over in Europe, and he thought, here's a money-making opportunity. So he had this vision to build a racetrack, but he needed land, and he went all over the Midwest. Finally, he got on a train based on a tip just outside downtown Indianapolis and took it west. As a matter of fact, on 16th Street, just across from the Speedway, there's a Speedway gas station. Just in the corner of that parking lot used to be a big rock. Carl Fisher got out, stood on top of that rock, and looked out over 328 acres of what was known as the Presley Farm. And he decided this might be my spot. That was back in December of 1908. By March of 1909, he'd gotten, of course, the other founding fathers to chip in and pay the money to buy the farm itself and start building a racetrack. Now, there's not much that you can see here at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway that is original to those days, except for this area. They call it the woods. This tree here looks like it's probably seen better days, but it's seen a lot more than that. This and the one that sits right next to it have seen everything that's ever happened at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. It's believed to be about 137 years old, meaning that both of these trees that sit right here in the north end of the Speedway are original to the land that Carl Fisher bought back in those days before the Indianapolis Motor Speedway was built all the way around it. There are a couple of other areas that are original as well. As a matter of fact, there's a creek area that comes from just across the Speedway, just across Georgetown Road. It comes underneath. It empties out in the turn 1 area of the racetrack. A lot of that area of the original creek was covered up when they built the road course here at IMS. But you just never know what it is about this place that might be able to awaken the past, the stories that can be told, the great names over the course of the years. Sure, we have Donald Davidson, the track historian, and we have books and pictures and movies and all kinds of things to tell us about what went on. But don't you wonder what could happen if these trees could talk? They've seen an awful lot as they stand here as the two granddaddies of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway.